Keanu Reeves was standing in the corner of the quiet room, his hands loosely clasped in front of him. The soft glow from the old wall lamps cast a warm shadow across his face, and his eyes were calm, yet distant, as if they carried the weight of something only he knew. Sandra Bullock was across from him, speaking gently with a small group of people. Her voice was steady, kind, but there was a pause in her words when her eyes met his. The air was heavy with an unspoken tension. No one in the room knew why Keanu had been so quiet that evening. Some thought he was simply tired, others assumed he was deep in thought. But Sandra knew Keanu long enough to sense when something was different. She tilted her head slightly, a silent question in her gaze, waiting for him to walk toward her like he always did in moments like this. Instead, Keanu looked at her for a long second, almost as if he was making a decision that could not be taken back. And then, without a single word, he turned and walked in the opposite direction, straight toward Ana de Armas, who had been sitting quietly near the window, almost invisible in the dim light. The shift in the room was immediate. Conversations paused. Eyes followed his slow, steady steps. No one understood why he was heading to her, not even Ana. She looked up, surprised, her lips parting slightly as if to ask him what was going on. Keanu stopped in front of her and offered a faint smile. There was no rush in his voice when he finally spoke. "May I sit?" he asked. Ana nodded, still unsure. "Of course." As he sat down, his posture softened. The noise in the room seemed to fade, as though the world had drawn back to give them space. For a few moments, they didn't speak. Instead, Keanu looked out the same window Ana had been staring through, where the rain painted thin rivers on the glass. "You looked like you needed someone to sit with you," Keanu said finally, his voice calm but holding something deeper. Ana blinked, her brows pulling together. "Why me?" Keanu's answer was simple. "Because I know what it's like to be in a room full of people and still feel alone." Those words landed with a weight she didn't expect. Ana had been quiet the whole evening for a reason she hadn't told anyone. Her heart was heavy with something she thought no one noticed. But here he was, sitting beside her, as if he had read it without her saying a word. Sandra, still across the room, watched the two of them. She felt a strange mix of emotions, curiosity, respect, and something she couldn't quite name. She had known Keanu for years, worked with him, shared moments with him that most people never saw. But she also knew this. When Keanu chose to give his time to someone, it wasn't random. It was intentional. The others in the room slowly returned to their conversations, but their eyes kept drifting toward the pair by the window. There was something magnetic about the quiet connection forming there. Ana finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to come over." Keanu turned his gaze from the rain to her. "I know. But sometimes, not doing something feels heavier than doing it." There was a small silence between them, not uncomfortable but deep, the kind that made you feel like you were standing in a safe place for the first time in a long while. What Ana didn't know was that Keanu had been watching her from the moment she walked in. He noticed how her smile was polite, but didn't quite reach her eyes. He noticed the way she sat slightly apart from the group, her hands wrapped loosely around her drink as though she was holding on to something unseen. He had seen that same posture in himself, many years ago, and he knew what it meant. As the rain outside began to slow, Ana found herself breathing easier. It wasn't because she had shared her story. She hadn't. It was because someone had seen her without her needing to explain herself. Sandra quietly stepped away from her group and moved toward the window, stopping a few steps away. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. She simply stood there for a moment, watching two people share a silent understanding. There was no drama, no grand gesture, just the simple, quiet act of one person choosing to notice another. And sometimes, that changes everything. The rain had stopped, but the sky outside the window still carried a deep gray, as if the clouds hadn't quite decided whether to stay or leave. The faint sound of drops sliding from the roof into the gutters filled the silence around Keanu and Anna. Keanu sat with his hands resting loosely in his lap, not leaning in, not pressing her to speak. There was no pressure in his presence, and that was what made it strange for Anna. Most people tried to fill the quiet with words, to make the air feel less heavy. But Keanu didn't. He simply stayed, and the quiet between them began to feel less like an empty space and more like a safe one. "You don't even know me," Anna said finally, her voice low. Keanu smiled faintly, his eyes meeting hers for a moment. "You'd be surprised how much you can know without words." She looked away, unsure what to do with that answer. Her gaze landed back on the small group across the room. Sandra was there, speaking to someone, but clearly watching them every so often, her eyes soft yet searching. Anna let out a quiet breath. "You're wondering why I'm sitting here alone, aren't you?" "I'm wondering if you want to talk about it," Keanu replied gently. Her lips pressed together. She thought about telling him no, about keeping the wall up. She had built that wall carefully over the last few weeks, brick by brick, because it was easier to pretend she was fine than to let anyone in. But there was something about the way he asked, like he wasn't looking for answers for himself, but for her. "I had a moment today," she said slowly, "where I didn't recognize myself." Keanu didn't interrupt. "It was during a meeting," she continued. "Everyone was laughing, planning, moving forward. And I just sat there, thinking how far away I felt from all of it. Like I was in a different place, even though I was right there in the same room." She expected him to respond with advice or reassurance, but instead, Keanu nodded with a quiet understanding that felt more comforting than words. "Sometimes," he said, "you feel like you've stepped out of your own life for a moment, and you're just watching it happen without you." Her eyes met his again, this time sharper. "Yes, exactly that." There was a pause, and in that pause, Sandra took a slow step closer, pretending to be interested in the books on a nearby shelf. She wasn't eavesdropping, not exactly, but she wanted to be close enough in case Anna's voice dropped any lower. Anna's fingers traced the edge of her glass. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." Keanu's voice was calm, almost a whisper. "Maybe because you needed to tell someone who wouldn't try to fix you." Anna stared at him, her lips parting slightly. It was such a simple sentence, but it felt like he had peeled away something she had been trying to hide. The silence between them deepened again, but this time it was warmer. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow through the wet window. Then, without warning, the door to the room opened and a man walked in. His presence was sharp, quick, like a cold wind sweeping through. He looked around briefly before his gaze landed directly on Anna. Her posture changed instantly, shoulders tensed, breath caught. Keanu noticed. The man gave a small nod to her, almost like a greeting, but it carried something heavier beneath it, something unspoken. "I need to go," Anna murmured, her voice tight. She began to rise, but Keanu's hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, not holding her back, just reminding her she didn't have to move if she didn't want to. Her eyes flickered to his, and for the briefest second, something passed between them, fear on her side, reassurance on his. Sandra's expression changed as she watched. She didn't know the details, but she could feel it in the air. This was not just a casual encounter. Anna hesitated, then slowly sat back down. The man, seeing her remain seated, gave a small, almost mocking smile before turning away to speak to someone else. Keanu didn't ask. He didn't need to. Anna let out a shaky breath. part of why I've been keeping to myself." Keanu gave a slow nod, his voice steady. "Then maybe you don't have to keep it to yourself anymore." And though she didn't answer right away, something in her eyes shifted. Just a little. The wall she had built was still there, but for the first time in weeks, a small crack had formed. The room had started to warm again as more people drifted into light conversations, but for Anna, the air still felt heavy. She tried to steady her breathing, her eyes fixed on the window where the streetlight's reflection swayed in the thin puddles outside. Keanu didn't push her to speak. He leaned back slightly, giving her space, but his attention never left her. It wasn't the kind of attention that demanded anything. It was the kind that made you feel you could exhale without being judged. Sandra, standing just a few steps away now, pretended to browse through the books lined on the shelf beside her. She traced her fingers over the spine of one without opening it, but her ears caught every slight change in Anna's voice. Anna's fingers tapped lightly against the glass in front of her, a slow rhythm that betrayed her nerves. "That man. He's not dangerous exactly, not in the way people think when they hear that word." She paused, searching for the right words. "But he knows things about me. Things I wish he didn't." Keanu nodded, his gaze steady. "Things you're not ready for everyone to know." Her lips pressed together. "Yes." Outside, a car passed slowly, the sound of its tires cutting through the rainwater on the road. The noise filled the space between them for a moment, and when it faded, Sandra stepped forward. "Anna," she said softly, her voice warm. "Would you like some tea? It's fresh." Anna looked up, surprised to see Sandra so close. She hesitated before answering, but the kindness in Sandra's tone left no room for polite refusal. "Thank you. Yes." Sandra smiled faintly, giving her a nod before moving toward the small counter where a kettle was steaming. Keanu watched the exchange quietly, noting how Sandra didn't press her for details, only offered something small, tangible, and safe. When Sandra returned, she placed the cup gently in front of Anna. "Careful, it's hot." Anna wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into her fingers. "Thank you," she murmured again, this time with more weight. Sandra took the seat beside her, opposite Keanu. "You know," Sandra began, keeping her tone light, "sometimes when you can't say something directly, telling it in pieces works better. A small part here, a small part there. You don't have to hand over the whole thing at once." Anna looked between them. Keanu on one side, quiet and steady, Sandra on the other, warm but perceptive. There was something unusual about being caught between two people who weren't demanding her story, but were still ready to carry it if she chose to share. Anna took a small sip of tea. The steam curled around her face as she spoke. "When I first met him," she nodded slightly toward the man still across the room, "he was different. He helped me once, in a situation I thought I couldn't get out of. I trusted him." Her eyes dropped to the cup. "But trust is tricky. Once you give it to someone, you can't take it back completely, even if they change." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "And he changed?" Anna's jaw tightened. "He started using what he knew about me. Not to hurt me, not directly, but to remind me he could, if he wanted to." Sandra's brow furrowed, though her voice stayed calm. "That's still a kind of control." Anna nodded slowly. "It makes you live smaller, quieter, so you won't give them anything new to hold over you." There was a pause, the kind where each of them was careful not to let the moment collapse. Keanu finally said, "Living smaller isn't the same as living safer. Sometimes it just means you're letting someone else decide the size of your life." Anna's eyes lifted to his, and something in the way he said it felt like a mirror, reflecting not just her situation, but pieces of himself he wasn't saying aloud. The man across the room laughed at something someone said, the sound sharp enough to pull her back into the moment. Her shoulders tensed again. Sandra glanced at Keanu, a silent conversation passing between them, one that said they both understood this wasn't over. Anna didn't notice. She was staring into her tea, her thoughts tangled. She felt like she was standing on the edge of telling them more, but the ground under her feet was unsteady. And yet, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was standing on that edge alone. The evening moved forward in slow steps, the kind where minutes felt stretched thin, as if everyone in the room sensed something unspoken, but no one dared to name it. Anna tried to focus on her tea, on the warmth it gave her, but every so often her eyes flicked to the man across the room. Each time, she found him already looking back, not in an open stare, but in that subtle way that said he knew exactly what he was doing. Keanu had noticed too. He didn't confront it, not yet. Instead, he stayed close enough so she wouldn't have to feel alone. His calm presence, a quiet anchor. Sandra mirrored the same steadiness from the other side, speaking to her in soft fragments of conversation, never letting the silence feel like it belonged to the man. But then, the air changed. It happened when someone in the room called out to Anna. "Hey, Anna, can you help us with this?" She looked up to see a small group gathered near the piano in the far corner. They were smiling, but she hesitated. Going over there meant walking past him. The man noticed her pause. His smile was small, almost polite, but there was a glint in his eyes that said, "I know you don't want to walk past me." Keanu saw it. So did Sandra. Anna took a breath, clearly trying to convince herself to move. She rose from her seat slowly, her tea still in her hand. Keanu's gaze followed her every step, and as she reached the midpoint of the room, the man shifted, stepping slightly into her path. It wasn't obvious enough to draw attention from others, just a subtle repositioning, making her either stop or adjust her route. She stopped. Her hand tightened on the cup. Keanu's voice broke the space between them. "Anna." She turned toward him instinctively. "Come here for a second," he said, his tone even but firm, as if he was asking her something simple while making it impossible for her to ignore. She took the step toward him without thinking, and just like that, the man's position lost its hold over her. Keanu moved to stand beside her. "I'll walk with you," he said quietly, almost like it was just a polite offer. But there was no mistaking the message underneath. The man didn't move. He watched them pass, his smile fading only slightly. Sandra, who had been standing closer to the piano, saw them approach. Her face lit up in an easy, welcoming way that made the whole scene look natural to anyone else watching. "Perfect timing," Sandra said warmly, gesturing toward the sheet music. "Anna, you're just the person I needed." Anna stepped into the small circle by the piano, her pulse still unsteady, but her breathing beginning to slow. Keanu remained nearby, leaning casually against the wall. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was the statement. For a while, they all focused on the music, the sound filling the air and giving Anna a temporary shelter from the tension. Sandra kept the conversation flowing, deliberately making sure there was no gap for the man to insert himself. But even as the music played, Keanu's eyes occasionally scanned the room, marking where the man stood. When the song ended, Sandra leaned close to Anna and spoke in a voice low enough for only her to hear. "I don't know the full story yet, but I want you to know something. You don't have to handle this alone." Anna's throat tightened. She didn't answer right away, but the look in her eyes said she heard it. Keanu joined them at the piano. "Ready to head out?" he asked, as if it was a casual suggestion, but he was giving her a way out if she wanted it. Anna looked from him to Sandra, then to the man across the room. For a second, her eyes wavered, but then she nodded.
Yes.
And in that small nod she had made her first real choice to step out of the quiet control he had over her. As they left together, the man's gaze followed, unreadable. But Keanu and Sandra didn't look back, because sometimes the most powerful way to stand up to someone is to simply walk away with the people who will walk beside you. The next morning was brighter than the night before, but the light didn't feel any lighter to Anna. She sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, her tea cooling in front of her, untouched. She had barely slept. Even after walking out with Keanu and Sandra, the man's face had lingered in her mind, as if he had followed her in thought, if not in body. Her phone buzzed once. She didn't have to look to know who it was. The messages were always short, harmless on the surface, yet sharp enough to cut beneath the skin. She left it face down on the table. Across the city, Keanu was already awake, leaning on the counter of a small coffee shop. He had a quiet habit of checking in without making it obvious, and he intended to do that today. He wasn't the type to flood someone with calls or questions. He preferred to be the kind of presence that reminded you weren't alone without making you feel watched. Sandra, on the other hand, was more direct. She had already decided that if she didn't hear from Anna by noon, she would show up at her door. She didn't know the whole history between Anna and the man, but she didn't need to. She had seen enough faces, enough guarded postures, to know when someone was carrying a weight they shouldn't have to carry alone. Around midday, Anna finally stepped outside. The sun was bright enough to make her squint, but the city noise wrapped around her in a way that was almost comforting. She kept her pace steady, heading toward the small bookstore she sometimes went to when she needed to breathe. She never made it there. He appeared at the corner, leaning against a street lamp as if he had been waiting. His smile was casual, but his eyes told another story. "Morning," he said, stepping into her path. Anna froze, her heart thudding in her chest.
"I'm busy,"
she replied, trying to step around him. He moved slightly, not blocking her entirely, but just enough to force her to acknowledge his presence. "Busy avoiding me?" She felt the old familiar knot tighten in her stomach.
"I'm not doing this,"
she said, her voice low. "Oh, come on," he replied, still wearing that thin smile. "You make it sound like I'm the bad guy." Before she could answer, a voice called from behind her. "Anna." She turned. Keanu was walking toward them, his pace calm but direct. The man's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned. "Friend of yours?" Keanu didn't answer the question. He stopped at Anna's side, his presence filling the space between her and the man without needing to raise his voice. "We were heading somewhere," Keanu said simply. Anna blinked, catching on to the unspoken offer.
"Yes,
we were." The man tilted his head, studying Keanu for a moment. "I didn't know you two were close." Keanu's gaze stayed steady. "Now you do." It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive, but there was a certainty in his tone that made the space feel different. He was not someone you could push without consequence. The man gave a small, almost amused shrug, stepping back just enough to let them pass. "Have a nice day," he said, his tone smooth but carrying an edge. Keanu didn't respond. He simply began walking, and Anna matched his pace. As they turned the corner, Sandra appeared from across the street, holding a paper bag from the bakery. Her eyes flicked from Anna to Keanu, reading their faces instantly.
"You ran into him,"
she said, more statement than question. Anna nodded faintly. Sandra stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "Then we stopped giving him chances to find you alone." Anna looked at both of them, her throat tight. "You don't have to do this." Keanu met her gaze. "Yes, we do." And Sandra added softly, "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is stand where they can see you." For the first time in weeks, Anna felt something shift, not because the man was gone, but because for once, she wasn't facing him alone. 2 days later, the rain returned. It wasn't a soft drizzle this time. It was heavy, almost loud, as if the sky was trying to wash the city clean. Anna sat by her window watching the streaks slide down the glass. She had been quiet all morning, not because she wanted to be alone, but because she was thinking about what came next. Keanu and Sandra had kept close since that street corner. One of them always seemed to be nearby, not hovering, but present. Their presence was like a warm coat on a cold day, steady, protective, without making her feel trapped. That afternoon, she got the message. Short, as always. We should talk. Tonight. No location, no explanation. Just the same tone that had followed her for months. Anna stared at it for a long moment. Her first instinct was to ignore it, like she always did. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the way Keanu's voice had sounded when he told her, "You don't have to keep it to yourself anymore." Maybe it was the way Sandra had stood between her and the man without hesitation. So instead of deleting it, she stood up, picked up her phone, and called Keanu.
He wants to meet,
she said quietly when he answered. There was a pause.
Where? I don't know. But I think I want to stop running from him.
Keanu's voice didn't change. Then we'll do it together. By evening, they were walking toward a quiet cafe where the man often sat. The rain had slowed, but the air was still damp, carrying the smell of wet pavement. Sandra was there too, walking just beside Anna, her umbrella tilted slightly to cover both of them. Inside the cafe, the man was already seated, a half-empty cup in front of him. His eyes lifted as they walked in, narrowing slightly when he saw all three. "Didn't realize you needed an audience," he said, his smile thin.
This isn't an audience,
Anna replied, her voice steadier than she expected.
These are people who know me now. The real me.
He leaned back in his chair. I know the real you.
No, she said, shaking her head. You know pieces of my past. And for a long time I let you make those pieces feel bigger than they were. But they're not my whole life. Not anymore.
Keanu stood a step behind her, calm and solid, his eyes locked on the man. Sandra rested a hand lightly on Anna's arm, not holding her back, just letting her know she was there. The man's smirk faded just enough to show the first sign of frustration. So, what is this? Some kind of performance?
No, Anna said. This is me telling you that you don't get to stand in my way anymore. You don't get to make me feel smaller. You don't get to decide how much of my life I live.
Her voice didn't rise, but it carried a weight the whole cafe seemed to hear. A couple at a nearby table glanced over. The man shifted in his seat, his gaze flicking between Keanu's steady presence and Sandra's unblinking stare. He realized, maybe for the first time, that the space around Anna was no longer his to step into. He took his coat from the back of the chair and stood. Fine. Have it your way. Anna didn't move. She didn't flinch as he passed. She kept her eyes on the door until it closed behind him and the sound of his footsteps faded into the rain outside. Only then did she sit, her hands trembling just slightly. Keanu sat beside her, saying nothing, but the way he placed his hand on the table, close enough for her to feel, was enough. Sandra leaned in with a small smile.
You didn't just face him. You faced yourself.
Anna let out a long, slow breath.
I guess I did.
They stayed in that cafe for another hour, talking about nothing important, laughing at small things, letting the heaviness lift little by little. When they finally stepped back into the rain, Anna didn't feel the need to look over her shoulder. For the first time in a long time, she felt like the street was hers to walk. Keanu glanced at her as they walked toward the corner. So, where to next? Anna smiled. Not a polite smile, not a guarded one, but something real. Anywhere. As long as we're walking forward. And with Sandra on one side,
Keanu on the other, she stepped into the night rain, no longer hiding.